everybody and welcome back. This is part 4 of our Trumpeter 1/200 scale hood build. In this video I want to get to the point of completing the hull up to the point where it's at least in a coat of primer. I'll try and get the top coats on before the end of the week, but it might not be possible to do that. We'll see how we go. But at least a coat of primer anyway. Before we do that, there's quite a bit of etched brass work to be done. We've got to fit the degaussing coil, we have to do the portholes and scuttles that I mentioned in part 3. There's some trumpeter parts to fit that need a bit of modification before we do that. The after torpedo tube doors need replacing, and we're going to finish the prop shaft elements as well, and possibly fit the rudder, but I'm not quite sure about that. So we're going to be working quite a lot with etched brass today. To do that, I'll be going over to the bench and showing you how we go about that. I'm going to start off with the torpedo tube doors on the back and follow that on with getting on with the degaussing coil. So with that, we're going to get over to the bench and let's start doing some work. So I'm set up to do some work on the etched brass parts here. This is one of the Pontos frets that we'll be working with. It has all the degaussing coils on. You'll notice I'm working on a sheet of glass here. It's very important to have a solid surface underneath these parts when we're cutting them out, and that's because even on a firm cutting mat you do get a bit of a depression when you use the knife, and it can distort the parts, so it needs a really solid base to cut on. So we'll be working with a sheet of glass. I'm sorry that's actually causing a bit of a reflection, I think, in the camera, but I'm sorry about that. We're going to later on in the build I'll replace this glass with an opaque tile which does the job just as good, and obviously that'll cut out the reflection as well. So just a few things about working with the etched brass. I generally try and cut out with a number 11 blade, although you sometimes do have to be careful, and that's because sometimes the action of dragging a number 11 blade along the fret can distort the part, so you do have to be a bit careful with that. Otherwise you can use a curved blade and use a rocking motion to cut through the fret connection. The other knife that I'll be using in this video is just a square edge chisel to remove some of the plastic detailing on the trumpeter hull. The other things obviously are a very good pair of tweezers. These are my go-to etched brass tweezers. The glue that I'm going to be using is in the main using a gel type super glue. This is a Loctite that I think is fairly commonly available, and I use a gel because it just gives a little more time for the parts to set up. Sometimes when you use a very liquid, a very thin super glue, it bonds instantly, and the problem with that is if you've not got the part in exactly the right position, it's very difficult to debond them. I mean, obviously you can get cyano debonders, but it's often the case that trying to debond a very fragile part like this element of the degaussing coil often leads to damage. So you want to try and give yourself as much chance as possible to get that right. The other tools that I'll be using are a file, a very fine file, and this is a 400 grade thinny stick, and that's just to remove the very tiny connection points from the fret. It's a good idea to try and get as close as possible to the part, but sometimes you just leave a tiny little nub on the part itself. These Pontos parts are very good in the sense that they've got very, very fine connection points. In fact, in some areas it's difficult to see that they're connected. So you don't have an awful lot of cleanup, but it's just worth checking that you've not left any little bits on the part itself. When filing on a part like this, I avoid filing in that sort of direction, because what it tends to do is it can bend the part downwards or upwards and distort it. Once etch brass is bent and distorted, it's very difficult to get it back into its original condition. So what I do is I work along the part in that sort of motion, so you're not bending it, it's done in the same plane as the part. And it doesn't need an awful lot, just a quick couple of swipes is enough really to get this sorted out. The other tool that's good for this purpose is a pair of flat nose pliers. These are the ones without any teeth or serrations, so they're perfectly smooth, they're not going to make any marks in the etch brass. And what they do is it just allows you to hold the part next to the nub that I'm trying to remove. It's very difficult to see, it's probably need an awful lot of magnification on the camera to do this. So I'm holding it next to the little stub and working along in that sort of motion. And that, just a few passes like that, removes the part and cleans it up ready for use. So this is the area that I'm going to be working on first. These are the exits for the bilges, or the bilge pumps, that need to be kept. Here are the two after torpedo tube doors. They're repeated on the other side of the ship, and we're going to be replacing those with etched brass. I've tidied up all the top edge of the hull where the replacement etched brass degaussing coil is to be fitted. These two fittings here were blanked off torpedo tubes, the forward torpedo tubes that were no longer in use by 1941. It's interesting that when the wreck of the hood was found in 2001, these features were one of the first things that the team led by David Meehan actually recognised, and it did confirm that what they were looking at actually was the hood in the midsection part that was discovered. They were quite unique to the hood, so it was final confirmation, as if there was any chance that it wasn't. It was final confirmation that they had indeed located the hood itself. And they found the ship in three sections. The midsection here, the bow, which again was quite a distinctive feature. The prow of the hood was quite a distinctive feature, and the stern element. The midsection and the forward midsection were completely obliterated, and that was more or less around the positions of the forward and after magazines, which obviously exploded and caused so much damage. So there were just the three sections of the hood to be found on the seabed. So we'll press on with doing some etched brass work. I'll be starting off with the torpedo tube doors. So there's a little bit of work to be done here. The trumpeter moulding has these hinges set so that the doors are set some way away from this central, I'm assuming it's some sort of bracket. You can see on the Pontos parts that the hinges allow you to position the part flush to this bracket here, and that's correct. These doors were positioned very close to the central bracket, so we're going to have to take off this moulded door, and that's clearly why Pontos have moulded this as a double thickness etch brass part, and it's to allow us to completely replace the moulding that Trumpeter supplies. So we'll do that now. So that's all cleaned up. We'll fit the first door. So just a tiny spot here. So you can see the difference between the two positions. The Pontos part has obviously helped us to get that a little bit more accurate. So we'll have to do the other one next, and obviously the other side. So the two replacement doors are in place, and it's a good feeling to have the first pieces of etched brass. There are thousands to go yet, but it's the first step out, so that's all good. Moving on to the degaussing coil, the first thing that I want to do is to determine the position of the coil relative to the top of the hull side. And I can do that by using this section here, which goes almost vertically up the quarterdeck step. That's obviously a fixed length. I know that this bottom section was fairly close to the top at this point, so I can position that, and I'm going to do that with a piece of tape. So I'm happy with the position of this after part, and that fixes the position of this next section. Which in turn gives me the position of this top section here. I'm just comparing that with photographs. It looks more or less okay. So that'll be where I'm going to be putting the top section of the coil. So let's get this section in place, and then we can start to work around the rest of the hull. So this is the section of the Pontos instructions that we're working with for the degaussing coil. It's page 4. I've fitted these three sections across the quarterdeck step. I can go ahead and fit the next three. The forward section's a bit more tricky because it climbs up onto a fairing that was created to lift it over the hosepipe exits. In turn, that fairing fits onto the wooden deck, which obviously we're nowhere near being able to fit at the minute. So it's a bit tricky to work out the correct sequence for doing this part of the build. What I might do is cut this section out here from the etched brass degaussing cable and fit it together with the fairings when I come to do that at the right time. But I can press on and do all the rest. We can go around the stern and obviously round the other side. We've got the same issue here. There's a smaller fairing above the single hose pipe on the port side. So we might have to deal with that in the same way. But apart from that, we can get on and do the rest of the cable. So we can go ahead and cut out the next part. I'm using the number 11 blade to break through the connecting points. Just being careful not to bend the part as I'm doing it. They're very difficult to see where these connections are. I think that's free. I missed one there. So with the curved blade, it's possible just to rock along rather than drag the part, which obviously risks bending it. That's clean at the minute. This is a very long section. I think what I'm going to do is cement it in two halves. I'll probably go about halfway along with the glue and then come back once the part's positioned and get the rest in place. So not gluing the whole section enables me just to hold the top end off a little bit. So this is the section that we've not applied any cement to. So I'll just be able to lift that up and run some glue underneath and drop it into its correct position. So we're approaching the stern of the ship here, and I've marked out with some tape the line that I want the cable to take, and that's because from this point here, which is the last piece I've fitted, the cable needs to follow a line underneath this outcropping here, which has it's either a fair lead or a bollard on deck above, and from there it needs to pass above the stern hose pipe opening, which I've drilled out here. So it's important to get the right line in advance. I don't want to be waving around up and down to try and meet the right path. So I've just marked it out with some tape to make sure that I can confidently just drop it into place. So we'll do that now. So there we are, we've got the stern section of the cable fitted, and using that tape just helps us drop the piece into the right position so as it's tight up to the moulding there and it's wrapping round nice and tight over the back of the stern there. So we'll just press on now to the fore end of the ship. So we have this to fit on the side of the hull. It's some sort of chute, but it does need a little bit of modification before we can do that. The ridge here just needs removing. That's actually part of the degaussing coil that Trumpeter moulded, so we need to remove that, and a piece of etched brass coil goes over the top of that. So we'll just need to sand that smooth and get that fitted. So that's the coil running over the ducts now. So this is the front of the bow, and we're coming to fit this section of cable. The thing with this section is that there's only one place for it to go, and that's because it has to hit a number of reference points, if you like. The first one is this dip here at the front, which goes under this moulding, which is for either a bollard or a fairlead, I can't remember which, above. The second one is this dip here, which from a reference photograph in the John Roberts book shows that it was just behind porthole number 4 in this row here. Now you can see that it appears to be behind number 3, but that's because Trumpeter have missed a porthole out in roughly this position here. So we're going to have to drill that one. Having done that, that becomes porthole 4, and this is now in the correct position. Having it in that position means that it's slightly too long relative to the piece behind it, so we can just cut a little piece out of that to make it match up. The other thing that we need to do is to decide how to deal with these fairings, which were fitted to allow the coil to rise up over the hosepipe exits. And the way I'm going to tackle it is to just fit the fairing to the back of the degaussing cable at this point, so that it can fit flush to the top of the hull side and be in the correct position behind the cable. What I'm not going to be able to do is fit some little supports that go behind the fairing and which drop down onto the wooden deck, because obviously I've not fitted the wooden deck at this stage. But I'll be able to get all this cable in the right place. I'll be able to get the fairing correctly positioned down on the top of the hull side and get the face of it, the external face, painted. What I'll then have to do is fit the supports at a later stage after I've got the wooden deck on, and just tidy the back of these pieces up. So that's the way we're going to tackle it. The slight downside of that is that we're going to have this section here sticking up. It's quite prominent, so we're going to have to be careful not to bend or damage that later on in the build. But I think overall that's the best way of dealing with it. The other way would have been to cut this section of coil out and fit it once we've got the deck on, but I thought that that would be more difficult to get a good neat finish to the outside of the hull at this point, so we're going to tackle it the first way that I've described. We have the front of the degaussing coil fitted now, on the port side at least. So we've hit the reference points that we set out. We've got the dip here, we've hit this porthole here, we've drilled the additional porthole that Trumpeter missed out and trimmed the back where it connects here. One thing that I found useful was to make these, before I cemented the etched brass in place, was just to tape the coil when in the position that I wanted it, and just made some marks with a black marker, and that just allowed me to line the part up properly. We've got the fairing in place. This was glued to the back of the coil at this point, and it's flush down nice and tight on the top of the hull at this point, and from the reverse we can see how that fairing is fitted here, and there's a bollard which fits on the deck behind this gap here. We've got the other fairing to fit on the starboard side, something like that, along with its degaussing coil. So we'll flip the hull over and get the starboard side completed. I'm going on to the starboard side now. There's a bit of a problem on this side as well. Trumpeter have got too many portholes on this side. That one's an extra one that we're going to fill. And there were actually a couple of tiny portholes just next to these as well. So I'm going to see whether or not to put those in. I think they were a similar size to these row of 6 here. So having finished the installation of the coils, we're just going to move on now to dealing with the edge brass portholes. These are unnumbered on the Pontos fret, and they appear on several frets, as I say, unnumbered. So I've cut out a number. The hull takes, I think, 32 or 36, I can't remember now. But they've all been cut out, and I'm using some gloss varnish to fix them in place, bearing in mind that I'm going to put a coat of primer over the top of these shortly, which will provide additional bonding for them onto the hull side. And I'm using a wax pencil just to pick the parts up. They're very tiny, they're probably 1 millimetre across, and using the wax pencil just to get them into place. So we're just finishing up on the aft of the ship here with the last couple of portholes and dropping them in place, as I say, with a wax pencil, and then just making some final adjustments with some fine tweezers. And that's the result. They do look a lot better than the moulding that Trumpeter supply, which was just some plastic wriggles above the holes drilled in the side. I had a piece of tape on just to make sure that I'd got the alignment correct, and I'm just carefully peeling that off now just to avoid pulling any of the parts off. It's going to take a while before the varnish sets and the parts are firm. Just flipping over to the port forward side of the ship now, and we've done the porthole work there as well. Now I'm going to be using some MIG one-shot primer. It's the first time I've used this product. Just load it in the airbrush, and I'm just going over the areas where I've fitted the portholes. It'll just add some extra fixing for them over the top of the varnish and hold them in place. You can't do an awful lot of rubbing and messing about with them. You will pull them off if you do that. But under normal conditions, if you're careful, the varnish and the primer and a top coat as well will hold these parts in place fine. So we're going to go around the hull and do that. The primer will also give us clues as to where we need to do any more rectification work. Last job we have to do on the hull is to fit this piece here, which is an outside drain, drops down the side of the hull towards the forward port side. So we'll cut those. There's just 2 pieces there, so we'll cut those out and get those ready to fit. That's the last job we need to do in terms of the hull parts before we can get the thing painted. So for those of you who haven't worked with etch brass before and who haven't bent it, just to point out that there are actually 2 different sides to the part. One is smooth and one has the fold lines etched into it, and they are on the inside of the part when it's folded. Not only does the line show us where the bend has to be made, it also allows the part to form up alongside itself. So it just gives a little bit of space for the 90-degree bend to be made. If you try to do it the other way and bend that side up, what you'd end up with, if that was the outside, you'd have a gap or a line down the corner of the part. So just to be aware, it's a lot of people take that for granted, but it would be fairly easy for new people that have not done this before to just bend it the wrong way. So all we need to do is to slot the piece in along the marked line and tighten the tool down to make sure we get it perfectly straight. As I said, once we've bent brass, it's very difficult to reform. It's very soft metal. And I'm just going to use, actually I'll use the back of my tweezers. It's a nice flat hard surface, and we just bend through 90 degrees like so. So that's the first bend made. Nice and sharp, 90 degrees. And we'll do the other one. Obviously we can't make another 90-degree bend on the outside of the tool because it's too narrow, but there is another part of the tool that gives us a finger, if you like, that would allow us to push the part in. It doesn't go all the way, but it's enough for us to get the bend in the right position. And in this case I'm just going to use the edge of a blade to lift the part up and fold it. This part has a curve on the back, and that's because it fits into the curvature of the whole side, so that's obviously the right way around. And what I'm going to do is, rather than just attempt to glue this part onto the side of the hull, as you can see there's a very, very small contact point on either side of the part, and I'd find it quite difficult to get a neat finish on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue a piece of plastic on the inside so that it will be the plastic that's actually glued to the whole side, not the etch brass. The etch brass will be glued to the plastic interior, and that'll just enable me, I think, to get a neat finish on the part as it's glued into the hull. So we'll do that in a bit. So we have the part here with the insert inside, the plastic insert, and it's filed to the contour of the outside. You can see it doesn't protrude above, but we've got plenty of nice styrene contact point there to glue this part to the whole side now. So trying to work out the exact position for this drain, I've had to look at the references. I've looked in the John Roberts book. It's not particularly clear from the Pontos instructions exactly where along the hull side it needs to be fitted, but there's a good photograph of Hood from 1937 in Malta again, I think, with a good clear view of this drain underneath this particular porthole and level with the armour belt here. So we know exactly where that part needs to be fitted. While I was looking in the book, I was just curious as to what this drain might be. And it's level with the upper deck at this point. Or the top of it is anyway. And on the upper deck in this position were 3 cable lockers. So I'm guessing that this was the drain that removed the seawater that was dragged up by the cables and allowed it to drain back out of the ship. I'm only guessing about that. I've no idea exactly whether or not that's the case, but it seems the most likely to me. So we can get this part glued on now. For the top part I can use some super glue. So we have the draining position there, nice and secure. So that's the work finished on the hull, the etched brass work at any rate. So the degaussing coil is fitted, we've done the torpedo tube doors, the portholes have been replaced at the bow and the back of the ship, and the corrections have been made to the porthole arrangement at the bow. They're okay at the back more or less, but we've done the corrections on the front. I've fitted the prop shaft brackets here. I'm leaving the rudder off until I come to paint the whole bottom. And I've done some primer work, not as much as I wanted to do. I've just done the priming on the areas where I've fitted the etched brass, and that's because it serves 2 purposes really. It seals the etched brass parts in place, it just tacks them a little bit better. And it also reveals any errors that I've made where the parts aren't fixed properly, or where I've got some little glue spots and so on. So the primer just helps reveal those errors and helps you to correct them. I haven't primed the whole of the model, and that's because my usual primer I ran out of on Wednesday, and in the UK we went down into lockdown on Thursday night, so I can't just nip out to the shops and get some more. And I don't really want to use this MIG one-shot primer for the hull. It's just not quite as good as my usual primer, which is Tamiya Extra Fine in an aerosol, which I decant out for use in the airbrush. So I've ordered some online, should be here early next week. I think the online stores are still operating, so hopefully they'll be here early next week. I can get the hull primed in the primer that I want, and I want to get to the point of getting the hull painted by the next video, which will be part 5. So hopefully part 5 will go through the painting process for the hull, and I want also to get it mounted up on a more permanent baseboard. At the minute it's very cumbersome to be moving the hull around to manoeuvre it into position for working, so I want to get it on a baseboard, and that will prevent or help prevent damage to the etched brass work as I go along. Before part 5, I'm going to just do another quick video over the weekend which will make available the etched brass schedule that I've been doing. This was a schedule that I really was doing for my own use, because I wanted to make sure that I'd covered all the parts in the frets with the instructions themselves. And I've now finished that work, and I'm going to make it available to those of you that have got the Pontos set and are as puzzled perhaps as I was about where all the parts were fitting in the instructions and to make sure that we hadn't missed any out. So that's done, it's ready. I'll post it on the video an explanation of how to use the schedule and a link for how to access it for yourself. So that's coming up. I hope to see you next week. For those of you that are doing some modelling, I hope you have a good week at it. And if you're not, have a good week as well. So we'll see you next. Bye-bye.